It was February 25th, 2010, just your typical Thursday in San Diego County. The air was crisp, the skies were clear, and the community of Poway was going about its day like normal. People were driving to work, grabbing coffee, chatting about weekend plans, and completely unaware that something unthinkable was about to unfold. Now, if you'd seen Chelsea King that morning, you'd never guess anything was wrong. She was 17 years old, smart, talented, and driven. Like straight-up overachiever energy. She was one of those kids that didn't just participate in school. She owned it. National Honor Society, AP classes, piano competitions, student leadership. You name it, she probably aced it. She was also super athletic. She ran cross-country, and jogging was kind of her thing. It helped her unwind, helped her think. And that day, like many before, she planned to head out for a run after school. Her parents weren't worried. Why would they be? She was responsible, grounded, and she'd done this plenty of times before. She told them she was going to Rancho Bernardo Community Park, a scenic spot nestled in the northern part of San Diego. This place was beautiful. Trees lining the trails, families playing on the grass, couples walking their dogs. It was the kind of spot where bad things weren't supposed to happen. Chelsea even parked in the regular lot, just off West Bernardo Drive. Middle of the day, public park, totally normal. She slid her phone in her car, laced up her sneakers, and hit the trail. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. The sun started going down, and her parents noticed she wasn't home yet. At first, they probably brushed it off. Maybe she ran a little longer than usual. Maybe she stopped somewhere. But then, as the minutes stretched into hours, that quiet panic crept in. You know the feeling, when your gut knows something's off, even if your brain's still trying to be logical. They started calling her phone. No answer. They drove to the park. Her car was still there, parked just as she left it, but Chelsea was nowhere to be found. Her phone? Still inside the car. That was the moment everything shifted. This wasn't a case of losing track of time. This was something else. Something darker. They called the police, and to their credit, law enforcement immediately took it seriously. This wasn't some slow, let's wait 48 hours situation. Nope, they mobilized. Search teams were deployed. Helicopters scanned the terrain. K-9 units combed the trails. Volunteers, hundreds of them, came out in droves. People were handing out flyers, posting online, doing anything and everything they could to bring Chelsea home. Her face was suddenly everywhere. Posters, news reports, social media feeds. That wide, bright smile, gone without a trace. And still, nothing. What made it all so much worse was how random it seemed. There was no sign of a struggle. No footprints out of place. No dropped items. No sounds heard. Nothing captured on nearby security footage. It was like she vanished into thin air in broad daylight. People who lived nearby were on edge. Parents were clutching their kids a little tighter. Joggers stopped using the trails altogether. The whole community was in shock. As days passed, desperation started to kick in. The hope that maybe she just got lost somewhere began to fade. Everyone wanted to believe in a miracle, but deep down, they were bracing for something else. Something final. And behind the scenes, detectives were starting to follow leads, pulling in surveillance data, checking the sex offender registry. Because, yeah, Rancho Bernardo was pretty, but even pretty places have monsters lurking nearby. It's terrifying how fast things can change. 1 minute, you're living your life, going for a run, breathing in the fresh air, and the next, your name is the headline on every local news channel. Chelsea didn't know she was being watched. She didn't know a predator had been lurking, waiting, stalking that park. That's the thing that haunts you about this story. It wasn't a matter of being reckless or putting herself in danger. She did everything right. She stayed on public trails. She ran in the middle of the day. She let someone know where she was going. But none of that mattered when she crossed paths with someone like him. By the end of that week, the mood in the community turned from fear to pure dread. The park that had once felt so safe now felt like a crime scene frozen in time. The energy had shifted. Something evil had passed through. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but everyone knew. Chelsea wasn't just missing. She had been taken, and whoever did it was still out there. It would take a few more days before the truth would fully come to light. But that moment, that day, February 25th, 2010, was when everything began. When Chelsea King disappeared, a ripple effect started that would uncover buried secrets, connect to a long, cold case, and expose a broken system that let a predator walk free far too long. This wasn't just the story of a missing girl. This was the beginning of a horrifying pattern. And Chelsea? She was the spark that brought it all to the surface. When the sun dipped below the horizon on the evening of February 25th, 2010, and Chelsea still hadn't returned home, her parents felt that creeping dread no parent ever wants to experience. At first, it was denial. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she stopped to help someone. Maybe she just lost track of time. But as the minutes turned into hours, those rationalizations began to unravel, and fast. Something wasn't right. That deep, gut-level feeling that something had gone horribly wrong had sunk in. And they didn't waste time. They got in the car and headed straight to Rancho Bernardo Community Park, retracing the steps Chelsea would have taken that afternoon. And there it was, her car, parked right where she said it would be. Doors locked. Neat. Nothing seemed disturbed on the outside. But when I looked inside, her phone was sitting there. That's the moment things escalated from worry to terror. Think about it. What teenage girl goes for a run and leaves her phone in the car? Not in 2010. Not when you text your friends every 10 minutes or stream your running playlist. It didn't make sense. And her being gone this long with her phone untouched, that was the first chilling clue. Her parents called the police immediately. And to the department's credit, they didn't hesitate. They treated it as a potential abduction from the jump. This wasn't a maybe she ran away case. Chelsea was a high-achieving, responsible teen, honor student, driven, close to her family. She wasn't the type to just vanish. Within hours, the San Diego County Sheriff's Department had officers on site. K-9 units were called in. Helicopters with infrared cameras scanned the surrounding area. Officers and volunteers began walking the trails and scouring the brush. That peaceful tree-lined park, it turned into a fully mobilized search zone. And then the news broke. Local media stations caught wind of the story, and it spread fast. 17-year-old girl missing after run. That was the first headline. Then came the interviews, her parents, desperate and exhausted, pleading to the camera. Chelsea, if you can see this, please come home. We love you. We're looking for you. Those clips were everywhere. On the nightly news, on Facebook, Twitter. This was before true crime went viral every week, but Chelsea's face spread like wildfire. Bright eyes, warm smile, that senior portrait in her red shirt. It became the image burned into the minds of every Californian watching this unfold. Within 24 hours, the community stepped up in a way that was absolutely staggering. Hundreds of volunteers poured into the park to help search. People brought flashlights, maps, dogs, anything they thought might help. Strangers were coordinating search grids. Businesses were printing flyers for free. Local restaurants were donating food to the search teams. You had bikers, soccer moms, veterans, off-duty cops. Everybody came together. Chelsea wasn't just someone's daughter anymore. She was everyone's daughter. And the police weren't just hoping she was lost anymore. They were working the case like a full-blown criminal investigation. They started knocking on doors, pulling footage from traffic and surveillance cams, checking out the sex offender registry, and asking anyone who had been at the park that day if they saw anything. One witness came forward and said they saw a creepy-looking guy loitering around the area around the time Chelsea would have gone missing. Others mentioned a car that didn't seem like it belonged in the park lot. But nothing was solid yet, just puzzle pieces scattered in every direction. The thing that really fueled the fire was the location of the car. It was too perfect, parked, intact, like someone wanted it to be found exactly the way it was. It didn't look like a robbery. There was no sign of forced entry or a struggle in or near the vehicle. It was almost clinical, like whoever took her knew exactly what they were doing and wanted the car left untouched to delay anyone realizing she was gone. That kind of planning, it chilled investigators to the bone. Meanwhile, national media was starting to pick up the story. Chelsea's name started trending. Major networks were covering the case. Nancy Grace ran a segment on her. The King family was doing everything they could to keep her face on TV, hoping that maybe Just maybe someone saw something and would come forward. But with each passing day, hope began to wither. And still, no Chelsea. Just that haunting scene. Her car parked silently in a lot that now felt like a crime scene. Her phone, a digital lifeline, left behind like a forgotten trinket. It was as if she had stepped off the planet, without warning, without a trace. By this point, search crews had expanded to include the nearby woods, canyons, and trails surrounding the lake. They used infrared drones, underwater sonar, and even cadaver dogs. Nothing. Not a scrap of clothing. Not a shoe. Not a sign of a struggle. It was as if she had evaporated into thin air. But those who knew better, investigators who'd seen these cases before, they were already thinking the unthinkable. Someone had taken her, and they had done it fast. But that car, that phone, that's what turned Chelsea's disappearance from a personal tragedy into a national nightmare. It was the quiet, sterile horror of her belongings being exactly where they should be, except she wasn't. It was the starting gun for what would become one of the most high-profile searches California had seen in years. And it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the search for Chelsea King stretched into its third and fourth day, investigators were no longer entertaining hopeful scenarios. They weren't just combing trails for a lost teen. They were hunting a predator. The urgency turned electric. Detectives started zeroing in on what little clues they had: witness statements, park surveillance footage, and GPS data from cell towers. The theory was quickly shifting. Chelsea didn't disappear. She was taken. The question now was by who? That's when the name John Albert Gardner III slithered its way into the investigation like a venomous snake hiding in plain sight. Now, let me set the tone here. This wasn't some surprise twist. Gardner wasn't a nobody. He was a known name in the system. A registered sex offender. A man with a history so disturbing, he should have never been walking free, let alone lurking near a public park full of teens and joggers. Here's how it started. A few witnesses reported seeing a man hanging around the Rancho Bernardo Community Park area on the day Chelsea disappeared. They described him as odd, out of place. One woman jogging the trail even recalled a man who made her skin crawl, just standing there, staring. She got away, but she never forgot his face. That description made its way to the police, and something about it tripped a wire in their system. Meanwhile, the FBI had started going through GPS tracking data, and law enforcement began cross-referencing local sex offenders who lived in the area or had any GPS monitor devices. Now, this is where technology came in clutch. John Gardner was on parole for a previous conviction, and part of his parole, he had worn a GPS ankle monitor at one point. The data from that monitor, though not currently active, was still accessible. They started pulling historical tracking information, trying to line up any known movements around the park. And guess what? That data showed Gardner had been in the area of Rancho Bernardo Community Park on the same day and around the same time Chelsea went missing. Boom. That was the moment the room went quiet. But here's the thing. John Gardner didn't just happen to be nearby. He lived in Lake Elsinore, about an hour away from that park. There was no good reason for him to be at that location. No job interview, no family visit, no friends in the area. Just presence. Suspicious, unexplained presence. Now, when police pulled his records, it painted a disturbing picture. Gardner wasn't just your average parolee. Back in 2000, he had been convicted of molesting a 13-year-old girl. He served only 5 years of a 6-year sentence. And that conviction? It came with red flags so massive, it's a miracle, or rather, a tragedy, that no one reined him in harder. During that earlier case, psychologists had already warned the court that Gardner was a continued danger to young girls, saying he had a severe predatory disorder and violent tendencies. Let that sink in for a second. This guy had already served time. He was supposed to be monitored. He should have been on everyone's radar. Yet somehow he was free, unchecked, and back to his old patterns. Only this time he escalated. Once Gardner's name entered the suspect pool, things moved quickly. Undercover surveillance was placed on him. Investigators began tracking his movements. And sure enough, his behavior was sketchy. He knew the walls were closing in. On February 28th, 2010, just 3 days after Chelsea's disappearance, police moved in and arrested John Albert Gardner III outside a coffee shop in Escondido. The tension in the community was explosive. People were furious. How was someone with Gardner's history allowed to roam freely? Why wasn't his GPS monitor active 24/7? How many warnings had been ignored? But none of that mattered more than one thing. Was Chelsea still alive? Once in custody, Gardner initially clammed up. Typical predator tactic: deny, delay, confuse. But detectives kept the pressure on. They brought in forensic teams, combed through his car, searched his home, and dug into every inch of digital data he owned. Emails, search history, text messages. One clue at a time, it all pointed in the same direction. And here's the kicker. Gardner didn't just confess to Chelsea's murder. He admitted to another one that had been cold for over a year. The 2009 disappearance of Amber Dubois, a 14-year-old from Escondido. The cases were connected, and Gardner was the common thread. It was like pulling a loose string and unraveling an entire tapestry of horror. The revelation shocked not just the investigators, but the entire state of California. Suddenly, Chelsea's tragedy wasn't an isolated incident. It was the grim finale of a pattern that should have been stopped years ago. So when police used GPS tracking and witness statements to zero in on Gardner, it wasn't just a breakthrough. It was a wake-up call, one that exposed failures in the parole system, gaps in monitoring, and the terrifying truth that monsters don't just live in the shadows. Sometimes they walk free. And for Chelsea King and Amber Dubois, that failure cost them their lives. All right, buckle up, because this next part, it's the part that makes your blood boil. If there's one moment in this story where the system failed Chelsea King and Amber Dubois in the most unforgivable way imaginable, it's this one. Because long before John Albert Gardner III ever set foot in Rancho Bernardo Park, long before Chelsea ever laced up her running shoes, Gardner had already shown the world exactly what he was. Back in 2000, when Gardner was just 21 years old, he was convicted of molesting a 13-year-old girl. Not alleged, not accused, convicted. He pled guilty to charges of lewd and lascivious acts with a minor, crimes that carry massive psychological and emotional trauma for the victims, and crimes that scream, hey, maybe this guy shouldn't be walking around unsupervised ever again. And this wasn't some gray area case. No misunderstanding, no dating someone underage drama. This was predatory, calculated, and violent. Gardner reportedly lured the girl into a situation where she couldn't escape. It wasn't just physical abuse, it was psychological. And the aftermath? She was left shattered. And Gardner? He got 6 years in prison. Just 6. That's it. But wait, it gets worse. Despite multiple psychologists and court evaluators waving massive red flags during sentencing, like red flags the size of Texas, the system still managed to drop the ball. One mental health expert warned the court that Gardner had significant predatory traits and was a high risk to reoffend. They didn't just casually mention this. They said, flat out, that he should never be around children. One evaluator even stated that he exhibited signs of violent sexual fantasies, lacked empathy, and had no remorse. In a functioning justice system, this guy should have been locked away or at the very least heavily monitored post-release, right? Like ankle monitor, lifetime registration, mandatory therapy, check-ins every week, the works. But instead, he served just 5 years. Not 6, not 10, 5. Then he was released in 2005, back into society, with nothing more than a parole officer and a spot on the sex offender registry. Let me just say this. The registry is not a babysitter. It doesn't stop predators from offending. It's basically a digital sticky note saying, hey, this guy's dangerous. Don't let him near your kids. But it doesn't track their movements. It doesn't monitor their behavior unless someone's actively watching. And Gardner? He knew how to game the system. He passed polygraphs. He stayed under the radar. He did just enough to avoid raising alarms, while still feeding his dark urges. He even lived with his mother in a house that, ironically, was within walking distance of schools and parks. You'd think that'd be a violation of his parole, right? Nope. Nobody stopped him. And here's the real kicker. After his release, Gardner violated parole multiple times, including one incident where he was caught living too close to a school and possessing pornography, which is a big no-no for registered sex offenders. Did they throw him back in prison for that? Of course not. They gave him a slap on the wrist and let him keep going. So now you've got a violent sex offender, diagnosed as high risk, released early, not monitored properly, violating parole, and nothing is done. He's out. He's walking. He's lurking in places like Rancho Bernardo Park, watching teenage girls go for jogs, just waiting for the right moment. And that's the part that sticks with you. Because Chelsea King didn't have to die. Amber Dubois didn't have to disappear. The system had this guy. They knew what he was, and they let him go. Gardner wasn't a mystery. He wasn't a hidden threat. He was a walking, talking time bomb, and everyone close to him could see it. A friend of his even reported years later that Gardner had confessed dark thoughts, talking about wanting to hurt someone again. He said out loud, and still, no one stopped him. So when he struck again in 2009 and then 2010, it wasn't a surprise to those who had been paying attention. It was a slow-motion tragedy unfolding right in front of our eyes. And the most brutal part? When the public learned that Gardner had a record and that he should have been locked up, the outcry was volcanic. Parents were furious. Advocates were disgusted. The King and Dubois families were left asking a question no parent should ever have to ask. How many warnings did the system need? Because Gardner's prior conviction wasn't just a red flag. It was a siren. And yet, here we are. 2 girls gone. 2 families destroyed. All because a predator was given a second chance he never should have had. March 2nd, 2010. It's the day everything stopped. The day hope officially turned to heartbreak. 5 agonizing days. Chelsea King's family, friends, and an entire community have been holding on, praying, pleading, clinging to any thread of a miracle. But that thread snapped in the cruelest way imaginable when search teams discovered what everyone had feared deep down from the beginning. Chelsea's body was found near Lake Hodges, not far from the trail at Rancho Bernardo Community Park, where she had last been seen jogging. Now let's talk about that spot for a second, because it's important. It wasn't just some random lake. Lake Hodges is in a semi-secluded area with thick brush, rocky terrain, and trails that wind off in directions the average hiker wouldn't venture. In other words, it's the kind of place someone would have to know. You don't stumble across it by accident. And it just so happens John Gardner had frequented that park. He'd even posted online about going there. The area where Chelsea's body was discovered was partially hidden, as if someone had made a rushed effort to conceal what they'd done. Search dogs had been brought in early on, but the terrain made everything difficult. What eventually led them to the site was a combination of cell phone data, soil samples from Gardner's car, and forensic intuition. The moment they arrived and confirmed the worst, you could practically feel the oxygen leave the room. She was found partially clothed. Her body showed clear signs of sexual assault and strangulation. It wasn't a peaceful passing. It was brutal. It was violent. It was something out of a nightmare, inflicted on a girl who was supposed to be safe on a 5-mile jog through a public park. Chelsea had simply gone out to train for a cross-country meet. She was healthy, happy, 17, full of life and ambition, and she was stolen by a man who never should have been free in the first place. The medical examiner's report would later confirm the trauma she endured. She had been raped, strangled, and left in that location, abandoned like trash by someone who didn't see her as a person. And that is the evil you're staring in the face with this case. Gardner didn't just kill Chelsea. He violated every piece of who she was. He destroyed a life, shattered a family, and left permanent scars on an entire community. And here's the chilling part. Gardner didn't confess right away. In fact, the discovery of Chelsea's body was what finally forced his hand. Police had already arrested him, and while the evidence was mounting, DNA, GPS tracking, witness reports, the body was the final nail. Once they found her, once they had the forensics to prove the assault and the murder, Gardner's options ran out. He eventually led police to her exact location. Though that's often painted as him helping, make no mistake, it was damage control. He was trying to cut a deal. And what he offered next sent another shockwave through California. Gardner confessed not only to Chelsea King's murder, but also to the 2009 disappearance and murder of 14-year-old Amber Dubois, a case that had gone cold for over a year. Amber had vanished while walking to school in Escondido. No witnesses, no trace. Until Gardner. Chelsea's death was the key to unlocking a chain of events that exposed one of the darkest failures in law enforcement and the justice system in recent memory. Her murder wasn't just tragic, it was a preventable act of violence, carried out by someone who was already known to be a danger to young girls. The discovery at Lake Hodges broke people. Candlelight vigils popped up across the state. Thousands gathered to honor Chelsea, lighting candles, holding signs, and wearing orange, her favorite color. And it wasn't just about mourning her. It was a message. This shouldn't have happened. This won't happen again. Not if they could help it. Her parents, Brent and Kelly King, turned their unspeakable loss into a mission. They began pushing for new legislation, what would become known as Chelsea's Law. The goal? To fix the system that had let their daughter's killer slip through the cracks. To increase penalties for violent sex offenders, to prevent early release from monsters like Gardner, to make sure no other family had to experience this same kind of hell. But even as the system began to shift, the ache remained. Chelsea's life had been one of kindness, passion, intellect, and compassion. She was an AP honors student, a talented pianist, a competitive runner, a beloved daughter, sister, and friend. And now, her legacy had been tied to one of the most heinous crimes in California history. So March 2nd isn't just the day her body was found. It's the day a community was transformed forever. The day a monster was exposed. And the day the fight for justice became personal for thousands of families who realized, if it could happen to Chelsea, it could happen to anyone. And that's the gut punch of this story. Chelsea King didn't die in silence. Her voice, her memory, her spirit, they became a movement, a demand for change, a call to action, and a reminder that evil doesn't just hide in shadows. It walks among us, sometimes just one trail away. During interrogation, Gardner confessed to murdering Amber Dubois, who vanished in 2009 while walking to school. In a chilling confession that shocked investigators and the public alike, John Albert Gardner III admitted during a police interrogation to the murder of 14-year-old Amber Dubois, a quiet and intelligent teenager from Escondido, California. Amber had vanished without a trace on the morning of February 13, 2009, as she walked to Escondido High School to deliver a Valentine's Day gift, a lamb she had purchased for a school project. For over a year, her disappearance haunted the community, with extensive search efforts, media coverage, and public rallies organized in the hopes of finding her alive. The break in the case came only after Gardner was arrested in connection with the rape and murder of another young girl, 17-year-old Chelsea King, in early 2010. As the investigation into King's murder unfolded, DNA evidence and Gardner's criminal background linked him directly to the crime, and suspicions quickly turned toward the unsolved disappearance of Amber Dubois. At that time, many feared the worst, but still hoped for a miracle. However, the truth would prove more horrifying than anyone had anticipated. During hours of interrogation following his arrest, Gardner, then 30 years old, admitted that he had abducted and murdered Amber in a moment of cold-blooded predation. According to detectives, Gardner confessed that he encountered Amber as she was walking alone along North Broadway, a route she often took to school. Without hesitation or remorse, Gardner lured or forced her into his vehicle. From there, he drove her to a remote, rugged area north of Escondido, where he assaulted and killed her. Gardner provided authorities with chillingly precise information about the location of Amber's remains. Acting on that information, investigators located her bones in a secluded, heavily wooded area near Poway, California. It was a desolate place, far from any beaten path, so remote that without Gardner's cooperation, they may never have found her. The confirmation of her death brought an end to months of painful uncertainty for her family, though it was a resolution steeped in grief and horror. The confession was part of a plea deal that Gardner struck with prosecutors. in exchange for pleading guilty to the murders of both Amber Dubois and Chelsea King, as well as the attempted assault of another woman. Gardner was spared the death penalty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Amber's family, the plea deal was a double-edged sword. It delivered answers and avoided the anguish of a prolonged trial, but also required them to confront, in graphic detail, the final moments of their daughter's life. Amber's case had remained a painful mystery for more than a year. Her disappearance prompted massive search efforts involving volunteers, law enforcement agencies, and national media. Her family never gave up hope, holding candlelight vigils and working with the community to keep her story alive. The day she disappeared, many assumed she had run away. But her parents, particularly her father, Maurice Mo Dubois, insisted that Amber was not the type of girl to vanish voluntarily. Their intuition was tragically correct. What made Gardner's confession even more devastating was the knowledge that he was a convicted sex offender, having served time in prison for sexually molesting a 13-year-old girl in 2000. Despite his prior conviction, he had managed to reintegrate into society with minimal supervision. His ability to slip through the cracks of the criminal justice system and commit 2 more brutal murders sparked widespread outrage and calls for reform in how authorities monitor sex offenders after their release. Amber's murder, along with Chelsea King's, prompted legislative changes in California, including Chelsea's Law, a measure that increased penalties for violent sexual offenders and strengthened monitoring requirements. Though no legislation could undo the pain caused by Gardner's crimes, these changes were seen as necessary steps toward protecting other potential victims from similar fates. In the years since the confession, Amber's memory has been honored through various efforts. Her family established the Amber Dubois Foundation, an organization committed to helping families of missing children and advocating for stronger child protection laws. The foundation has played a key role in raising awareness about the dangers young people face and the need for constant vigilance. For many, the story of Amber Dubois remains a haunting reminder of how suddenly and inexplicably life can change. She was a girl with dreams, aspirations, and a bright future, senselessly taken by a man who never should have been free. Gardner's confession, while bringing clarity to her disappearance, also exposed systemic failures that had deadly consequences. It's hard to find the right words to describe the horror of the moment when Amber Dubois' remains were discovered. After over a year of agonizing uncertainty, Amber's family, her mother, her father, her friends, her community, finally had an answer, though it was the worst kind of answer imaginable. What had been a cold, unrelenting mystery was suddenly made painfully real as the truth that had been lurking in the shadows for so long was dragged into the light. The answer, like so many answers in cases of this nature, was ugly. And in this case, it was chilling because it came with an almost bone-deep realization. The person who had taken Amber from them, who had snatched her off the street, destroyed her life, and then discarded her, was someone who had been living in plain sight, someone who had already hurt others, someone who had left their community in the dark for months, knowing all the while where she was and what had happened to her. On March 2nd, 2010, as Chelsea King's body was discovered near Lake Hodges, the investigation into Amber's disappearance was also about to take a monumental, grim turn. Gardner, now facing charges for Chelsea's murder and slowly beginning to crack under the pressure of his own guilt and the mounting evidence against him, finally did what investigators had been hoping he would do all along. He confessed to killing Amber, and not just that, he directed authorities to where they would find her. Amber's remains were found in Poway, California, a rural area located in the northeastern part of San Diego County. The search team, following Gardner's directions, combed through rugged, desolate terrain near the Poway Indian Reservation. This wasn't an easy place to search. Overgrown brush, dense forests, and rough, hilly land that could easily swallow up a body and keep it hidden for years. It was the perfect location for someone like Gardner, someone who understood how to evade detection, how to stay just one step ahead of the authorities. When Amber's remains were finally found, it wasn't just the closure her family needed. It was the confirmation of their worst fears. The identification process, as heartbreaking as it was swift. The remains had been in the ground for over a year, hidden in a way that made it impossible for investigators to find her until Gardner finally gave them the location. What made the discovery even more brutal was the sheer coldness of it all. Amber wasn't just another nameless victim to Gardner. She wasn't some random casualty. No, she was someone he had carefully planned for. He'd followed her movements, and he had stalked her, choosing to make her his next target. And then, after the crime, after the murder, he had hidden her body in a place so remote that it could have stayed undisturbed for decades. And yet, for all the time that passed, Amber's family never gave up. Every day that passed without an answer, they held on to the hope that somewhere, somehow, Amber's case would be solved. It wasn't just about justice. It was about knowing what happened to their daughter, knowing that she hadn't just disappeared into thin air. And for the longest time, that was the torture, not knowing. It was the hole left behind by the mystery. Every hour spent wondering if she was still out there, whether she was alive or dead, was an hour they would never get back. When Gardner finally led police to Amber's remains, it was like a long-awaited exhale for a family that had been suffocating for over a year. It was the moment they would finally get to say goodbye, but at the same time, it was the moment their grief would take on a new shape. No longer could they pretend. No longer could they hold onto the fragile hope that Amber was out there, somewhere, still alive. That hope had been stolen too. But even in the face of that immense loss, Amber's parents, like Chelsea's, turned their grief into action. They took that anguish and channeled it into advocacy, using the discovery of Amber's remains as the fuel for their fight for justice. Amber's law, much like Chelsea's law, became a legislative battle cry, a call for better protection for children, stronger laws for sex offenders, and a more responsible justice system that wouldn't allow monsters like Gardner to slip through the cracks again. Amber's remains were found, and while that brought the mystery of her disappearance to an end, it didn't bring closure. Not in the way people think about closure. There was no peace to be found in that discovery. It didn't heal the wounds that had been carved into Amber's family, her friends, her entire community. The damage done by her murder was so profound, so all-encompassing, that the discovery of her remains only marked the beginning of a long and painful journey toward justice, toward change, and toward making sure no other family had to endure this same nightmare. In the end, Amber's case, just like Chelsea's, would become a symbol of what can happen when a system meant to protect the innocent fails. Gardner was a predator. He had been allowed to remain free after his prior convictions. He had been given the opportunity to strike again and again, and he had taken it. But at least with Amber's remains being found, at least with the truth coming to light, some measure of accountability began to unfold. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough. But it was something, and for the Dubois family, that something was worth fighting for. John Gardner's story, like so many tragic stories involving serial offenders, is a perfect example of the dangerous consequences of the system failing to protect those it is meant to serve. Gardner wasn't just any criminal. He was a known threat, someone with a history that, if taken seriously, should have kept him locked away, far from the reach of innocent victims like Chelsea King and Amber Dubois. But instead, Gardner slipped through the cracks, repeatedly violating parole and still managing to walk free, giving him the space to commit the heinous acts that would devastate two families and a community. Gardner's criminal history was far from a secret. His past was a red flag that was impossible to ignore. In 2000, he was convicted of molesting a 13-year-old girl. He was sentenced to prison, and by all accounts, that should have been a wake-up call. But it wasn't. After serving just 5 years of his sentence, Gardner was released despite a clear pattern of behavior that should have made him a lifelong risk to society. Authorities were quick to label him a registered sex offender, but being registered doesn't automatically mean that a person is actively monitored in a way that would prevent them from committing further crimes. In Gardner's case, that oversight would prove to be disastrous. Once out of prison, Gardner was required to follow strict parole conditions, as sex offenders often are. He was supposed to be closely monitored. His movements, his behavior, his habits, Everything was supposed to be watched, carefully tracked. But here's where things started to go terribly wrong. He didn't face the scrutiny he should have. Gardner didn't comply with the rules, and he did so frequently. He violated his parole several times between his release and the murders of Chelsea King and Amber Dubois. These violations weren't small matters, either. He broke some of the most important conditions of his release. He failed to register his address properly. He failed to comply with required meetings with his parole officers. And at one point, he was even caught using drugs, which is, of course, a serious violation of parole for anyone, but especially for a convicted sex offender. Each one of these violations should have been treated as a red flag, a clear warning sign that Gardner was unfit for freedom. But, for whatever reason, the authorities failed to act. This failure to take his violations seriously is a crucial part of the puzzle that led to the deaths of Chelsea and Amber. If Gardner had been sent back to prison for any of these violations, the murders of these two young girls could have been prevented. But instead, he was allowed to remain free. And as we now know, he used that freedom to stalk, attack, and kill. Let's take a step back for a second and consider just how dangerous this was. Gardner was a predator. He had been convicted of sexual offenses before. He had shown a pattern of violence, of targeting young girls. Yet, despite his clear risk to public safety, the authorities chose to let him slip through. They didn't act with the urgency or vigilance needed to prevent further harm. They allowed him the space to act on his violent impulses without the necessary intervention to stop him. Think about it. Parole is supposed to be a safety net to help reintegrate offenders into society. Yes. But when a person repeatedly violates parole, especially when they have a history of violent and sexual offenses, that safety net should be cut. Gardner's history, combined with his continual disregard for the rules, should have been enough to put him back in prison. Yet, time and time again, the system failed to act. And this isn't an isolated incident. This is a reflection of a broader issue within the system, where too many offenders, particularly sexual offenders, are either overlooked or given too much leeway. The consequences are dire. Lives are lost, families are destroyed, and entire communities are left to pick up the pieces. And that's exactly what happened with Chelsea King and Amber Dubois. The failure to enforce Gardner's parole and take action when he violated the terms was not just a mistake. It was a devastating lapse in judgment that allowed a repeat offender to remain free, giving him the opportunity to harm more people. Gardner was a ticking time bomb, and the authorities knew it. But they did nothing to stop him before he could take that next step, and the results were tragic. In the wake of Chelsea and Amber's murders, the families were rightfully furious. They had lost their daughters to a man who should have never been allowed to walk free, a man who had shown time and again that he was a threat. They felt betrayed by the system, and with good reason. It wasn't just about the pain of losing their children. It was about the anger at the systematic failures that allowed their murders to happen in the first place. Brent and Kelly King, Chelsea's parents, were particularly vocal in their advocacy for tougher laws and stronger oversight of sex offenders, especially those who had violated parole. They pushed for the passage of Chelsea's law, which sought to impose harsher sentences and stricter monitoring for repeat offenders. The law was passed, but it came too late for Chelsea and Amber. And while the new laws could help prevent future crimes, they couldn't bring back the lives that were lost. Gardner's repeated violations of parole should have been a wake-up call for the authorities. The fact that it wasn't is a stark reminder of the failings in how we treat sexual offenders, particularly those who have already shown a propensity for violence. It's a tragic reality that far too many offenders are let off the hook, given a second or third or fourth chance, and allowed to hurt more innocent people. In the end, Gardner's failure to follow parole wasn't just a footnote in his story. It was the critical factor that led directly to Chelsea and Amber's deaths. The authorities had the chance to stop him. They had multiple opportunities to intervene, but they didn't. And because of that, the consequences were catastrophic. The pain and anger felt by Chelsea King's family and the community after a tragic death were not just about the loss of a bright, loving young woman. They were also about the overwhelming sense of injustice. Chelsea had been taken by someone who should never have been allowed to walk free. John Gardner, despite his violent history and repeated violations of parole, was allowed to remain on the streets, where he could prey on innocent victims. The realization that the system had failed them, that Chelsea's murder could have been prevented, sent shockwaves through her family and the public. For Chelsea's parents, Brent and Kelly King, their grief became fuel for a crusade for justice. They could not and would not stand idly by while the system continued to fail other families. They made it their mission to ensure that what happened to Chelsea never happened again. Chelsea's case exposed the dangerous loopholes in the system, loopholes that allowed violent sex offenders to evade proper monitoring and, in Gardner's case, to continue violating parole without facing the consequences. They turned their unimaginable pain into something more powerful, a fight to change the laws. And so, the tragic murder of Chelsea King became the catalyst for change. In the months following her death, Chelsea's law was drafted and eventually passed in California. This law, championed by Chelsea's family, advocates, and public officials, was aimed squarely at making sure that predators like John Gardner could no longer slip through the cracks of the justice system. It was a direct response to the failures that had allowed Chelsea to fall victim to a known sex offender, and to ensure that violent sex offenders were no longer given the leeway that Gardner had been afforded. The core focus of Chelsea's law was to impose stricter penalties and oversight on violent sex offenders. One of the key components of the law was its mandate for life sentences without the possibility of parole for those convicted of violent sex crimes against children. It also targeted repeat offenders, ensuring that individuals like Gardner, who had shown a clear history of sexual violence, could be kept behind bars for life. For sex offenders who had committed violent crimes, there was no longer the option of parole. The law's creators also pushed for an expansion of the mandatory GPS tracking of sex offenders. The hope was that by tracking their movements, authorities could better monitor these individuals and prevent further crimes. But Chelsea's law wasn't just about penalties. It was also about prevention. The law introduced tighter regulations for how sex offenders were supervised after their release, addressing the many gaps in the system that had allowed Gardner to violate his parole repeatedly without facing any meaningful consequences. Chelsea's law gave parole officers and law enforcement the tools they needed to enforce the rules strictly, ensuring that convicted sex offenders would face immediate retribution for even the smallest infractions. This would make it far harder for offenders to reoffend, as the authorities would be able to respond immediately to any violations. The law also increased penalties for those who committed crimes involving child pornography, sex trafficking, and online sexual exploitation, making it clear that any crime of a sexual nature against children would not be tolerated in California. It was a comprehensive approach to combating sexual violence, specifically targeting the types of offenses that had allowed Gardner to slip through the cracks. The effort to pass Chelsea's law was not an easy one. It required a tremendous amount of advocacy, public pressure, and political negotiation. But with the public's outrage over the murders of Chelsea King and Amber Dubois, along with the passionate support of Chelsea's family, it quickly gained momentum. Activists, lawmakers, and everyday citizens rallied behind the law, pushing it through the legislative process with urgency. And in 2011, less than a year after Chelsea's death, Chelsea's law was signed into law by Governor Jerry Brown. The law was celebrated as a victory for justice, a necessary change to make sure that the same mistakes that led to Chelsea's and Amber's deaths could never happen again. But while Chelsea's family could take some comfort in knowing that their daughter's death had sparked such important legal change, it wasn't enough to undo the pain and heartbreak of losing her. No law, no penalty, no amount of reform could bring Chelsea back. Still, for many, Chelsea's law represented something important, a concrete step toward protecting vulnerable children from the monsters who preyed on them. It also sent a message: the law would no longer be lenient on violent offenders. The justice system had failed Chelsea King, Amber Dubois, and their families in the past, but with Chelsea's law, the fight for change had resulted in meaningful reform that would protect other children from the same fate. But even though Chelsea's law was a landmark piece of legislation, it was also a bitter reminder of the cost of such reforms. It was a law born out of heartbreak, a law forged in the aftermath of tragedy. It served as a grim reminder that sometimes the most meaningful change comes only after the most devastating loss. But Chelsea's parents, through their pain, their anger, and their grief, turned that tragedy into something that could prevent future suffering. As the law passed and gained momentum, it sparked a nationwide conversation about how the justice system treats sex offenders. How can we allow someone like John Gardner to slip through the cracks? What more can be done to prevent future attacks and ensure that those who have already shown their violent tendencies aren't allowed to walk free again? And while Chelsea's law answered some of those questions in California, the fight for stronger protections and better monitoring continues across the country. In the end, Chelsea's law was a testament to the courage of a family who refused to let their daughter's death be in vain. It's a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, people can come together and demand change. And for all the families who have been affected by similar tragedies, Chelsea's law represents a hard-fought victory, but also the understanding that this fight and the fight for justice will never truly be over. After being convicted of the brutal murders of both Chelsea King and Amber Dubois, John Gardner was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court's decision was a bittersweet moment for both families. While it was a much-needed and long-awaited conclusion to a lengthy legal process, it didn't bring their daughters back. It didn't undo the horrific loss they had suffered. What it did bring, however, was the certainty that Gardner would never have the chance to hurt anyone else again. He was locked away for the rest of his life, his days of preying on vulnerable victims officially over. But for Chelsea King's and Amber Dubois' families, the fight didn't end with Gardner's conviction. The pain of their daughters' deaths would never go away, and no verdict, no sentence, would ever make up for the hollow spaces left in their lives. Instead, what they found was an opportunity to turn their heartbreak into something positive, something that could save others. Their daughters' deaths may have stolen their future, but their advocacy would serve as a testament to their memories, a way to make sure that their deaths had a lasting, positive impact on the world. Brent and Kelly King, Chelsea's parents, in particular, became fierce advocates for victims' rights and sex offender reform. Through their grief, they channeled their energy into efforts aimed at ensuring that violent sex offenders would no longer have the chance to evade justice. They tirelessly pushed for laws that would better protect children and would punish violent offenders to the fullest extent of the law. They continued to speak out on behalf of their daughter and other victims, using their public platform to share their story and advocate for legislative change. The Kings worked closely with organizations dedicated to child safety and victim advocacy. They became heavily involved in Chelsea's law, making sure that the law passed after Chelsea's death continued to have the kind of teeth needed to make a real impact. Through their advocacy, they lobbied for stronger monitoring of sex offenders, for the better treatment of victims, and for community-based initiatives to help prevent future tragedies. Their work wasn't just focused on California. They expanded their advocacy to a national stage, ensuring that Chelsea's legacy would resonate beyond the borders of the state. The Kings became outspoken about the need for reform in the way the justice system handles sex offenders and how it can better prevent future attacks. They urged lawmakers to hold sex offenders accountable and to ensure that those who had shown they could not be trusted were kept behind bars. Likewise, Amber Dubois' family, too, found their voice in the aftermath of their daughter's disappearance and death. Amber's mother, Carrie McGonigal, and Amber's father, Maurice Dubois, dedicated their lives to keeping their daughter's memory alive, and in doing so, they took up the mantle of advocating for victims' rights and safer communities. They worked alongside the Kings to advocate for stronger legislation on sex offenders and to ensure that no other child would fall prey to someone like Gardner. Amber's family, too, pushed for stricter laws to monitor and restrict the movements of convicted sex offenders. They worked tirelessly to ensure that Amber's law, inspired by Chelsea's tragic death, would have real consequences for violent criminals. Amber's father, Maurice, was especially vocal in his demands for stronger parole monitoring and for more rigorous tracking of offenders through GPS. Amber's family wanted the law to be a reminder to the world that while it may not be possible to bring Amber back, there was still time to prevent future tragedies. Through their grief and their loss, both families became a symbol of resilience. They took what could have been a private, isolated pain and shared it with the world, hoping that their experiences would inspire change, would push for tougher laws, and would help create a system where children were better protected from predators. They had the strength to continue advocating in the name of their daughters, to fight for every child who might otherwise fall through the cracks. Their ongoing efforts didn't just involve lobbying for legislation. It also meant continuing to raise awareness about the danger of repeat offenders and the need for vigilance in the fight against child sexual abuse. Both families created foundations in memory of their daughters to help fund programs aimed at educating children and parents about the risks, as well as how to recognize and avoid dangerous situations. Through their foundation work, they also provided support for other families affected by violent crimes. They knew firsthand what it was like to face the devastation of losing a loved one, and they made it their mission to offer others the resources, guidance, and strength that they had found. They understood that community, whether through the support of loved ones, professionals, or organizations, was key to helping victims' families heal and rebuild their lives. Gardner, serving life without parole, remains a constant reminder of how the justice system failed to protect Chelsea and Amber when it had the chance. His life in prison, while fitting, does nothing to reverse the damage he caused, nothing to undo the heartache he inflicted on their families. However, the work of Chelsea and Amber's families serves as a beacon of hope for others who might face similar pain. They've turned their daughters' legacies into something that serves to protect, educate, and inspire. As much as the passing of time helps the families heal, they've never stopped working for the change that would have kept their daughters safe in the first place. And despite the deep, unshakable grief, their advocacy for stronger laws, safer communities, and better treatment of victims continues to grow stronger. Their mission is a reminder that even in the face of unspeakable loss, the courage to fight for change and to give a voice to the voiceless can still prevail. Their daughters may be gone, but the impact of their advocacy will live on, making sure that their memories are honored and that their legacies help to make the world safer for all children.